I told myself I wasn't doing anything wrong, just chasing happiness after years of feeling invisible. I thought my husband would forgive me like always, that my family would understand, that people exaggerate everything anyway. Then the legal papers arrived, and suddenly, I was standing in an empty house with no job, no savings, and no one picking up the phone anymore. It began the night Gavin smiled at me across the bistro, the kind of smile that felt like a secret, even though I told myself it was nothing. Thomas was working late again, same as always, buried in numbers and meetings, so when Gavin struck up a conversation, I let him. I said it was harmless, just words over coffee, but when he asked for my number, I gave it to him before I even thought about it. At home, I told Thomas my phone kept buzzing because Clara needed help with her school project, and he believed me like he always did. That was the thing about Thomas. He trusted me completely, and instead of feeling guilty, I used it as proof that I deserved a little excitement after 17 years of being taken for granted. The first time I met Gavin outside of work hours, I told Thomas I was staying late at the clinic because the new software system was giving us trouble. In reality, I was sitting across from Gavin at a booth downtown, laughing at his stories about his ex-wives, like we were two people without families or mortgages or responsibilities. When Sophie, my sister, texted asking why I was out so late, I told her Thomas never listened anymore, that I deserved to feel wanted for once. She said maybe he should pay more attention before someone else did, and I let her think I was joking, even though we both knew I wasn't. That weekend, Thomas asked why the credit card showed 2 restaurant charges when I said I had been working late. I told him the clinic ordered food for everyone, made it sound so reasonable that he nodded and let it drop, and that was when I knew I could keep going. By the next week, the whispers had started at the clinic, 2 hygienists lowering their voices whenever I walked into the break room. I told myself they were jealous, that people loved to invent stories when someone else's life looked more interesting than theirs. Gavin had started texting less, saying his work schedule was crazy, and I hated how that made me feel like I was the one being strung along after giving up so much already. At home, Thomas was quieter than usual, eating dinner with Clara, helping her with homework, barely looking at me even when I tried to make small talk about bills or the weather. I told myself he was sulking because I snapped at him last week about forgetting our anniversary, that he was too proud to admit it, but there was something in the way he watched me sometimes that made my stomach twist. One afternoon, Sophie stopped by the house with coffee and asked if everything was okay, because Ruth had seen Thomas looking pale at church. I laughed it off, said work was stressing him out, but Sophie gave me a look like she didn't believe me. She asked if I had talked to him lately, really talked to him, and I said Thomas didn't like talking about feelings, so what was the point? That night, Thomas came home late carrying a folder I hadn't seen before. He said it was work stuff when I asked, his voice so even, it almost sounded like nothing at all. He didn't mention the credit card again, didn't ask why I came home late twice this week, didn't say much of anything really. I told myself his silence meant he didn't suspect a thing, but deep down I wasn't so sure anymore. The following week, Thomas grew even quieter, moving through the house like someone checking boxes on a list I couldn't see. He left early for work, came home in time for dinner, asked Clara about her day, then disappeared into his office with that same black folder every night. I told myself he was burying himself in spreadsheets like always, but deep down, I knew this was different. He wasn't distracted. He was planning something. On Wednesday, a courier arrived while Thomas was at work, handing me a thick envelope stamped with legal language I didn't understand at first. I flipped through the pages and saw words like separation petition and custody motion, my name printed over and over in black ink. My hands shook so badly, I dropped the envelope on the counter. When Thomas came home, I demanded to know what this was. He said calmly it was exactly what it looked like, that he'd already filed the paperwork. His voice was even, polite, like he was discussing the weather instead of tearing our lives apart. I told him he was humiliating me over gossip, letting bored neighbors destroy our family, but he didn't raise his voice or argue. He just said Clara deserved stability, that the court would decide what happened next. Later, when I called Sophie, hoping she'd take my side, she asked quietly if the rumors were true. I said no, of course not, but even to me the words sounded thin. By Friday, Thomas told Clara she'd spend the weekend with Ruth and Harold. He didn't ask if I agreed. He just packed her bag while I stood there holding papers that made everything feel like it was already over. The next week moved like a storm I couldn't get out of the way of, no matter how many times I told myself Thomas was bluffing. He left early Monday morning wearing his only navy suit, the one he saved for important meetings, carrying that black folder like it held all the answers. When he came back that evening, he didn't say a word to me about where he'd been, just made dinner for Clara and helped her with her math homework while I sat at the table, pretending to read through the legal papers again, like I understood half of what they meant. On Tuesday, I went to see a lawyer of my own because Sophie insisted I needed one. The woman behind the desk flipped through the documents Thomas had filed, explaining them in a calm, professional tone that made my stomach hurt. Temporary custody request, asset freeze order, preliminary property division under the prenup. Thomas and I had signed 17 years ago when I laughed at the idea because I was so sure we'd never need it. My lawyer asked if the allegations about the affair were true. I told her Thomas was twisting gossip to make me look bad, that none of it was serious, but she didn't look convinced as she kept reading. By Wednesday, the joint bank account was frozen. The credit cards, too. I found out at the grocery store when my card was declined, standing there with a line of people behind me while the cashier gave me that polite smile people use when they're trying not to stare. I paid with the little cash I had left and drove home, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my hands ached. Thomas was in his office when I walked in, talking softly on the phone with someone. The door half closed, like he didn't care if I heard his side of the conversation or not. On Thursday, Ruth called to say Clara would stay with them through the weekend because things were too hectic at home. Her tone left no room for argument, like the family had already decided where they stood. That evening, Thomas left another envelope on the counter without a word. Inside were visitation schedules, temporary custody dates, and financial instructions from the court spelling out exactly what I could and couldn't do until the final hearing. By Friday, Gavin stopped returning my texts completely. He hadn't answered since the day Sophie told me she saw him at the bistro with someone else. And I knew then he was gone for good, leaving me to deal with the wreckage alone while Thomas built his case piece by piece with the same steady patience I once thought was kindness. The final hearing came on a grey Monday morning, with rain streaking down the courthouse windows and the air inside heavy with the smell of wet coats and floor polish. Thomas was already there when I arrived, sitting with his lawyer at a long table stacked with neat piles of documents, the same black folder he had carried for weeks now, open like a final verdict waiting to be read. He didn't look at me when I sat down beside my own lawyer, didn't nod or speak or acknowledge me at all. It was like we were strangers who had never shared a house, a daughter, or 17 years of life. The judge began by reviewing everything Thomas had filed: the temporary custody order he had already been granted, the asset freeze that had left me standing at grocery store checkouts with declined cards, the financial statements showing exactly how much he had handled over the years, while I barely knew which bills were due each month. My lawyer tried to argue that gossip and speculation weren't proof of anything, but Thomas's lawyer presented more than rumors. There were bank statements with dates and charges at the bistro when I said I was working late. Witness statements from neighbors who saw my car outside Gavin's apartment on nights I told Thomas I was at the clinic. Even security footage timestamps from downtown restaurants, silent black and white images stacked neatly on the evidence list. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice was calm, even, the same tone he had used for weeks while I kept telling myself he was just being dramatic. He said this wasn't about anger or punishment, but about Clara needing one stable home where school nights didn't feel like battlegrounds. He said the house should stay with the parent who had custody, so Clara wouldn't have to move schools or neighborhoods or live out of boxes while adults argued over mistakes that couldn't be undone. He said finances should be divided according to the prenup we had both signed long ago, the one I used to joke about because I never thought it would matter. He never raised his voice, never looked at me, never said my name more than he had to, but each sentence felt like a door closing one by one behind me. When it was my turn to speak, I told the judge Thomas was blowing things out of proportion, that I was unhappy but not unfaithful, that people loved to exaggerate and twist things until they barely resembled the truth. My lawyer tried to argue the custody request was extreme, that Clara needed both parents equally, but even as I spoke, I could feel how weak it all sounded against the steady rhythm of documents, dates, signatures, and statements Thomas had lined up in perfect order. The judge asked a few questions about work schedules, about who had managed the household finances, about why Thomas had been living in the guest room for weeks if everything at home was fine like I claimed. I didn't have good answers. The silence that followed each question felt louder than anything I said out loud. When the ruling came that afternoon, the words landed like stones dropping one by one into deep water. Primary custody of Clara to Thomas. The house awarded to him so she could stay in the same school, the same bedroom, the same neighborhood. Financial accounts divided under the prenup terms, leaving me with a fraction of what I thought I was entitled to because Thomas had kept most savings separate all along. Visitation schedules for me, printed neatly on the last page, like my time with my own daughter, was just another appointment to be penciled in between other people's plans. Thomas thanked the judge, shook his lawyer's hand, and began gathering his documents, while I sat frozen in my chair holding the copy the clerk handed me, the black ink spelling out the end of everything, like it was just another case closed before lunch. He walked out without looking back, Ruth and Harold waiting with Clara in the hallway, her small backpack already over her shoulder as she followed him out of the building and into a life that no longer had room for me. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.